welcome. It is so genuinely great to have you with us today.
Yeah, we are absolutely thrilled you're here joining us.
All right, welcome to another deep dive. This is the place where we take a stack of truly fascinating sources, articles, research, our own extensive notes, and we distill them down to the insights you absolutely need to know.
Exactly. And today, we are turning our attention to a monumental piece of literature.
Oh, it really is.
It's a story that it feels incredibly, almost uncomfortably relevant no matter what era you happen to be living in. We're going to be focusing specifically on Albert Camus's novel, The Plague.
Yes, the plague.
Huh?
And for this deep dive, we're looking directly at excerpts from the text itself.
Right, specifically relying on the masterful translation by Stuart Gilbert.
Which is such a brilliant translation, by the way.
It really captures the weight of it. And we should clarify, this isn't just going to be some high-level, Wikipedia-style summary.
No, definitely not.
We are going right into the source material to pull out the raw, unfiltered experience of what Camus was actually trying to convey. We're going to examine the psychology, the philosophy, and the sheer human endurance depicted in these pages.
Exactly. And the mission for you, the listener, today is quite profound. We are going to explore how a completely ordinary, modern, heavily commercialized town reacts when an absolutely unthinkable catastrophe strikes out of nowhere.
Because this story, it's not just a medical thriller about a disease.
Right.
It is a penetrating look at human psychology, at the nature of isolation, the concept of duty, and perhaps most importantly, the invisible plagues that we all carry around with us every single day.
It really is a text that forces a mirror up to the reader, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It challenges us to look closely at our own daily habits, our own comfortable routines, and asks us a very uncomfortable question.
What happens when all of that is shattered?
Precisely. How do we react when the illusions of control and permanence are suddenly stripped away?
Okay, let's unpack this by starting right at the beginning, with the setting of the story.
The setting is crucial.
It really is, because the setting is arguably the most important character in the early parts of this text.
Yeah, so the story takes place in the 1940s in the town of Oran, which is a French port on the Algerian coast.
But the way the source text describes Oran is so striking. It explicitly tells us that the town is, let's just admit it, ugly.
It has the smug, placid air.
Right. The text asks us to conjure up a picture of a town without pigeons, without any trees or gardens. You never hear the beat of wings or the rustle of leaves. It literally calls it a thoroughly negative place.
It is the absolute epitome of banality, and that is entirely intentional on Camus's part.
How so?
Well, the narrator makes a point of telling us that you only know it's spring because of the feel of the air or the flower baskets brought in by peddlers. It calls it a spring cried in the marketplaces.
Wow, yeah. So disconnected from nature.
Exactly. In summer, it's baked bone dry. In autumn, it's a deluge of mud. And the people who live there are a perfect reflection of this environment. They are entirely focused on commerce.
Just entirely.
The text says their chief aim in life is doing business. They work feverishly from morning to night solely to get rich, and then they fritter away their evenings at cafes, strolling the same boulevard, or just playing cards.
Which, sounds suspiciously like modern hustle culture, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a town that prides itself on being completely modern, which in this context means it's a town devoid of intimations.
No spiritual depth whatsoever.
None, devoid of deeper meaning. People love each other rapidly or settle into a mild habit of conjugality because they simply lack the time and the mental energy to do anything else.
They're just too busy.
Right. It's a place where everyone is fundamentally bored and devotes themselves entirely to cultivating habits.
And crucially, the text notes that it is a very difficult place to die.
Oh, that part is so vivid.
Right. Because everyone is so obsessed with business and health and the immediate physical realities of life, an invalid feels completely out of it.
Imagine being a dying man trapped behind hundreds of walls sizzling with heat, while the whole population is on the telephone discussing shipments, bills of lading, and discounts.
Death is just an inconvenience to the machinery of commerce.
Exactly. And before we get to the actual catalyst of the story, I think we really need to define a term that hovers over this entire narrative.
Yes, let's do that.
You can't really talk about Camus without talking about the absurd.
Right, the absurd. What exactly does that mean in the context of this utterly boring town for you as a reader?
That's a vital question. When we talk about the absurd here, we're talking about a terrifying philosophical collision.
Okay, a collision between what and what?
It's the collision between our deep, inherent human desire for order, meaning, and predictability, and a universe that is fundamentally cold, chaotic, and entirely meaningless.
Wow. So Oran is basically a town that has built an elaborate fortress of routine to hide from that.
Exactly. Commerce, cafes, card games, they use all of it to pretend the universe makes sense. The absurd is what happens when the universe kicks the door down and reminds you that your routines offer absolutely no protection.
And the universe kicks the door down in such an innocuous yet deeply unsettling way.
It really does.
So Dr. Bernard Rieux, our central figure, is leaving his surgery on the morning of April 16th. And he feels something soft under his foot on the landing.
It's a dead rat.
A dead rat. At first, he just kicks it aside and goes downstairs. It's only when he gets to the street that he thinks, wait, a dead rat has no business being on my landing.
Right, it clicks for him.
And he turns back to tell the concierge, Monsieur Michel, to remove it.
What's fascinating here is the immediate reaction of the concierge. And Michel is not concerned about disease or hygiene. He is genuinely outraged.
Outrage.
Yes, because, as he categorically states, there weren't no rats here. He is completely convinced that no rats exist in his building, so someone must have brought this dead one from outside as a prank.
I always find this reaction so incredibly human. Why is our first instinct almost always absolute denial when faced with an obvious threat?
It's cognitive dissonance in its purest form.
Right. And Michel's identity is tied up in being the concierge of a respectable, clean building. Yeah. A rat threatens his worldview, so he simply decides the rat is a practical joke.
It's the first instance of a theme that will dominate the early part of the story, the human instinct of absolute denial when faced with something that disrupts the accepted reality.
If he admits there are rats, he has to admit his building is flawed.
And by extension, his control over his life is flawed, so he rejects the evidence of his own eyes.
But the universe doesn't care about Michel's denial. The escalation is terrifyingly rapid.
It really accelerates.
That very evening, Rieux sees a big rat with sopping wet fur moving uncertainly, spinning around with a little squeal and falling on its side with blood spurting from its mouth.
It's a gruesome image.
And the next day, 3 dead rats are found in the hall. Soon, Rieux is counting dozens of rats in the garbage cans in the poorer districts. Within a very short time, the rats are dying by the tens of thousands.
The town is literally forced to organize mass cremations of rodents.
It's just staggering. And then the true horror shifts from the animals to the humans.
Right. The concierge, Michel, who was so outraged by the very idea of rats in his building, falls ill.
The ultimate irony.
He complains of swellings, thinking he just strained himself. But Rieux feels a hard lump, like a knot in wood, at the base of his neck. Michel's condition deteriorates rapidly.
It's incredibly fast.
He suffers a sudden, catastrophic fever, excruciating pain in his armpits and groin, and eventually dies in the ambulance. His life is snatched away before anyone can truly comprehend what is happening.
So Michel is the first official human casualty. You would think that a man dying of mysterious, agonizing buboes right after a town-wide die-off of rats would trigger an immediate emergency response.
Do you think so?
But the authorities are forced to look at this. And even then, they desperately don't want to see it.
Because seeing it requires action, and action disrupts commerce. The debate over vocabulary that follows is a masterclass in bureaucratic denial.
Oh, the medical committee meeting. Let's talk about that.
You have this meeting. Dr. Castel, an older colleague of Rieux's who has seen outbreaks in China and Paris decades ago, says outright, you know what it is.
He doesn't pull any punches.
No, he doesn't need postmortems. He recognizes the buboes, the fever, the vomiting. But Dr. Richard, the head of the medical association, and the town prefect are terrified of alarming the public.
Right. They debate whether they should call it plague or use a softer, less terrifying phrase like a fever of a typhoidal nature.
It's absurd.
Castel points out the absolute absurdity of this. He says his colleagues are reluctant to face facts because if it's officially admitted to be plague, they will have to take drastic, economy-crushing steps.
And notice the underlying logic the authorities are using. The prefect actually argues that Castel's logic is unsound. He says we shouldn't jump to conclusions.
Just buying time.
Exactly. Castel replies that the important thing isn't the soundness of the argument, but to make the administration think and act. The bureaucracy is using semantics to shield themselves from reality.
They believe that if they control the language, they can control the biological reality of the disease. If they refuse to say the word plague, it somehow isn't plague.
which is a fatal flaw. And while the bureaucrats are arguing about words, Dr. Rieux is struggling with the sheer incomprehensible scale of what might be happening.
There's a fascinating moment where Rieux is standing at his window, looking at the dull sky, trying to conceptualize what a plague actually means.
Yeah.
How does he even begin to process the historical numbers?
It's one of the most brilliant psychological insights in the text. Rieux remembers that some 30 great plagues known to history accounted for nearly 100 million deaths.
100 million.
But then he realizes that 100 million deaths means absolutely nothing to the human mind. He notes that when you've served in a war, you hardly know what a dead man is after a while. A dead man has no substance unless you've actually seen him dead.
So without faces, the numbers are just statistics.
Precisely. Rieux realizes that 100 million corpses broadcast through history are, as Gilbert's translation beautifully puts it, no more than a puff of smoke in the imagination.
A puff of smoke. That is such a haunting phrase.
He tries to force his brain to visualize it by imagining 10,000 dead in a single day, like in the Plague of Constantinople. He thinks, well, that's about 5 times the audience in a big-ish cinema.
He's trying to do the math.
Right, you'd have to collect the people at the exits of 5 picture houses, lead them to a city square, and make them die in heaps just to get a clear notion of what it means.
He's trying to use logic and math to comprehend an entirely absurd, uncontrollable reality. He even tries to calculate the 40,000 rats that died in Canton by imagining them placed end to end.
It's our desperate need to quantify terror to make it manageable.
And we should pause here to mention the broader context that readers of the 1940s would have immediately recognized.
Yes, the historical allegory.
Camus was writing this during and immediately after World War II. The plague is widely understood as an allegory for the French resistance and the Nazi occupation of France.
Exactly. The rats creeping into the city, the initial denial by the authorities, the attempt to downplay the threat so as not to disrupt business. This closely mirrors the creeping rise of fascism in Europe.
People didn't want to see the brown shirts in the streets as a mortal threat.
They thought it was a temporary fever that would pass.
That adds such a chilling layer to the bureaucratic denial. They aren't just ignoring a disease, they are ignoring the death of their society.
And all the while, the deaths in Oran are climbing. 16 deaths, 24, 28, 32.
And the weather is beautiful.
The sun is shining, the flower vendors are selling roses, and the plague is quietly, methodically killing more people every day.
Which brings us to the inevitable breaking point. The day the death roll touches 30, the authorities can no longer hide behind semantics. The illusion shatters.
Rieux receives an official telegram from the prefect. The wording is stark and bureaucratic, yet apocalyptic in its implications.
What does it say again?
It says, proclaim a state of plague, stop, close the town.
So, when physical science fails them and the death toll keeps rising, the town is suddenly severed from the rest of humanity. How does a modern city go from ignoring dead rats and debating vocabulary to being completely physically cut off from the world?
That telegram drops like a guillotine.
It initiates what the text describes as the profound agony of exile.
Once those town gates are shut and all ships are turned away, every single person in Oran realizes they are trapped. And the most immediate striking consequence of this sudden closure is the abrupt, violent deprivation of human connection.
People who had just said goodbye to loved ones on a train platform for a few days' trip are suddenly hopelessly cut off.
Rieux's own situation is heartbreaking here.
Yeah, let's talk about his wife.
Just a day or two before the rat crisis truly exploded, his wife, who had been ill for a year, left for a sanatorium in the mountains.
Timing.
He had put her on a sleeping car, apologized for not taking better care of her, and promised they'd make a fresh start when she returned. And now, she is out there and he is trapped inside.
Mothers and children, lovers, husbands and wives, all unexpectedly parted without the slightest warning.
But the narrator makes a crucial distinction here. This isn't just physical separation, it's an exile in one's own home. And the pain of this exile is uniquely agonizing because it becomes a mass-produced grief.
I want to dig into that term, mass-produced grief. What does that actually look like in practice for the people of Oran?
Think about it this way. In normal times, if you are missing someone, your grief is individual. It has nuance. It's attached to specific memories, the smell of their hair, a joke you shared. It makes you unique. But under the plague, everyone is suffering the exact same separation. The text is brilliant on this point. It explains that when someone tried to unburden themselves, to share their unique pain with a neighbor or a friend, The reply they got always missed the mark.
Because the listener is also grieving.
Yes, and because language itself fails them. The person speaking is speaking from the depths of long days of brooding. Their grief is shaped by passion. But the listener only hears a conventional emotion, a standardized marketplace grief.
They are using the current coin of language, the cliches of everyday conversation, to try to express the inexpressible.
Exactly. So the sincerest grief has to make do with set phrases. It's an incredibly isolating experience. You are surrounded by thousands of people experiencing the exact same pain, yet you have never been more alone.
We've all seen a version of this recently, haven't we?
Right.
When a global crisis hits and suddenly every corporate commercial on TV features somber piano music and a voiceover saying, "In these unprecedented times, we are all in this together."
It feels incredibly hollow.
It's the language of mass-produced empathy, which isn't really empathy at all. It's just a set phrase.
That is a perfect modern analogy, and no one embodies the struggle against this mass-produced exile more than the character of Raymond Rambert.
Rambert, the journalist.
Yes, Rambert is a young, determined-looking journalist from Paris who came to Oran to write a report on the living conditions of the Arab population. He gets trapped when the gates close. He leaves his wife behind in Paris, and he absolutely refuses to accept that he should be subject to the town's fate.
Rambert has this intense confrontation with Dr. Rieux. He tracks Rieux down and essentially demands a medical certificate, saying he doesn't have the plague so he can leave.
And Rieux refuses.
Rieux refuses, saying he can't confirm Rambert isn't carrying the disease, and even if he could, the law is the law. Rambert gets angry. He says, "But I don't belong here." And Rieux tells him, "Unfortunately, from now on, you'll belong here, like everybody else."
It's a harsh reality check.
But I have to play devil's advocate here. You really have to sympathize with Rambert, right? Why should he sacrifice his one chance at happiness, his reunion with his wife, for a town he doesn't even live in? Isn't Rieux being a bit of an unfeeling bureaucrat here?
Rambert is fighting for personal happiness. He refuses to let a bureaucratic rule steal his life.
Right, so isn't he justified?
It's a completely understandable reaction, and Rambert actually uses that exact argument against Rieux. He tells Rieux, "You can't understand. You're using the language of reason, not of the heart. You live in a world of abstractions."
A world of abstractions.
Rambert represents the individual rebelling against the collective catastrophe. He views Rieux as a cold administrator of rules.
But Rieux isn't just following rules for the sake of it.
No, he isn't. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of Camus's philosophy, this is where the concept of solidarity begins to form. Rieux's internal reaction to Rambert's accusation is deeply telling.
What does he think?
After Rambert leaves, Rieux thinks about that word abstraction. Is he living in an abstraction when he's spending his days in a hospital while the plague kills 500 people a week? Rieux admits to himself that yes, there is an element of abstraction in these mass calamities.
Right, because the plague itself is an abstraction. The text explicitly says plague, like abstraction, was monotonous.
Exactly. Every evening, Rieux sees mothers wailing with a distraught abstraction over the fatal stigmata on their children's bodies. Every evening, it's the same useless words, the same tears, the same ambulance sirens.
It's relentless.
But, and this is the crucial pivot for Rieux's character and the philosophical core of his actions, he realizes that when an abstraction is killing you, you have to get busy fighting it.
You can't just wish it away with personal feelings.
Precisely. Rambert thinks his individual love story exempts him from the abstraction. Rieux knows that the bacillus doesn't care about your love story. The abstraction is deadly, and the only way to deal with it is through the grueling, monotonous, collective work of treating the sick.
Rieux isn't being cold. He is accepting the horrifying reality of the situation, whereas Rambert is still in the denial phase, believing his individual exceptionalism will save him.
And while Rambert plots his escape, the atmosphere of the town settles into this haunting, prolonged state of exile. The imagery used to describe the townspeople during this period is chilling. They are described as sleepwalkers.
Sleepwalkers, wandering the dusty, treeless streets, wasting away emotionally as well as physically. They are marking time.
The text describes this drone of low voices and incessant footfalls, a huge concourse of people pacing back and forth, timed to the eerie whistling of the plague in the sultry air above.
The whistling of the plague in the air. What a terrifying detail. It's a never-ending, stifling sound that represents the blind endurance that has ousted love from all their hearts. They aren't living. They are just waiting.
Just waiting.
But in that agonizing state of waiting, human beings inevitably search for meaning. They cannot tolerate a catastrophe that has no reason. If science and bureaucracy can't stop the dying, the people demand a narrative that explains why they are dying.
And that opens the door for religion to step in. This brings us to how different minds in Oran process the inexplicable nature of the plague. The most prominent public attempt to assign meaning comes from the church, specifically from a Jesuit priest named Father Panelou.
Father Panelou is a fascinating figure. He delivers a highly anticipated dramatic sermon at the end of the first month of the plague.
It's quite a scene.
It's a wet, windy day, the cathedral is packed, and Panelou gets up into the pulpit and delivers an absolute fire and brimstone speech. He doesn't offer comfortable words or hollow sympathy. He starts with a line that must have echoed like thunder in that church.
What was the line?
"Calamity has come on you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserved it."
It is a terrifying declaration. Panelou frames the plague entirely as an act of divine retribution. He says the time is past for gentle advice. Today the truth is a command. He describes the plague as a red spear sternly pointing to the narrow path, the one way of salvation.
He's providing the ultimate macro narrative. The universe isn't absurd, it's angry.
Exactly. For Panelou, in this first sermon, there is no absurd. There is cause and effect. He argues that the pestilence is God's way of punishing the town's sins, their complacency, their obsession with commerce over spiritual matters.
He essentially says that God has grown tired of waiting for them to turn to him, so he has loosed the flail of the plague to beat them into submission and repentance. It's a theology of justified punishment. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. You'd think a sermon like that would cause mass panic. You'd picture people falling to their knees in the streets, a huge religious revival sweeping the town.
Right.
But the reaction of the townspeople is bizarrely muted.
The narrator calls it a curious frame of mind objectivity. The people listen to Panelou tell them they are being punished by an angry God, and their reaction is basically to shrug and note that participating in a week of prayer can't do any harm.
It's so transactional. They treat God the same way they treat a business negotiation.
Because they are utterly exhausted. It perfectly captures the psychological toll of the prolonged crisis. They are too worn down by the daily reality of the death toll, the sheer physical exhaustion of fear, to be truly terrified by theological threats.
They treat the sermon with the same detached utilitarian mindset they treat everything else. If a prayer might work, sure, they'll try it, but it doesn't fundamentally change their existential dread or alter their daily habits.
And contrasting completely with Father Panelou's grand cosmic explanation is the deeply personal coping mechanism of a character named Joseph Grand.
Oh, Grand. I love this character.
Grand is this humble, aging municipal clerk. He works in a bureaucratic office all day, and he volunteers to help Rieux with secretarial work for the medical efforts at night. But Grand has a secret passion.
He is dedicating his life to writing a novel. And how he writes this novel is the ultimate example of a human wrestling with the absurd.
It is simultaneously hilarious and heartbreaking. Grand spends his nights obsessively, painstakingly rewriting the very first sentence of his manuscript over and over and over again.
Just the first sentence.
Yes. The sentence is, "One fine morning in the month of May, an elegant young horsewoman might have been seen riding a handsome sorrel mare along the flowery avenues of the Bois de Boulogne."
It's such a flowery sentence.
He wants it to be absolutely flawless. He tells Rieux that he wants the publisher to read that one single sentence, stand up and say, "Hats off."
While the plague is whistling overhead, killing hundreds of people, Grand is debating adjectives and the rhythm of a sentence about a horsewoman. On the surface, it seems crazy. But if we distill this down to a psychological takeaway, Grand is showing us something profound about human nature.
What's that?
He shows us that in the face of macro-level trauma that we cannot possibly control, humans will obsessively micromanage the trivial things we can control just to maintain our sanity.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. He can't control the plague, he can't control the death rate, but he can control the placement of a comma in that single sentence. He seeks absolute perfection in a tiny, manageable space because the outside world has become a chaotic nightmare. Grand's obsessive writing is an act of rebellion against the chaos.
And it contrasts so sharply with the messages coming from the outside world. The text mentions that people would listen to the radio broadcast from other countries. The outside world is trying to send sympathy.
The radio voices.
Right, the announcers say things like, "Oran, we're with you." But the text notes that these broadcasts sound hollow and epical. They use prize speech verbiage. Rieux listens to them and realizes the utter incapacity of every man truly to share in suffering that he cannot see.
Right, because the outside world is using the language of general humanity, a vocabulary that is completely unsuited to describing what Grand is doing, or the daily grind of the hospitals. The radio voices say, "We're with you," but Rieux thinks to himself, "You aren't with us to love or to die together, and that's the only way to truly be with someone."
Their sympathy is genuine, but it's utterly useless against the physical reality of the bacillus. You cannot defeat a biological or fascist plague with thoughts and prayers or hollow radio declarations.
Which is exactly why the narrative pivots away from those seeking meaning in theology or art or outside sympathy and focuses on those who realize that survival requires unglamorous, exhausting physical action.
While some pray and some write, others realize the plague demands a logistical, physical response. And this brings us to the formation of the sanitary squads, which is driven by arguably the most fascinating character in the text, Jean Tarrou.
Tarrou is the philosophical heart of the novel. He's a stocky, youngish man with bushy eyebrows who was just visiting Oran when the plague hit. He is an observer.
He keeps that diary.
Yes, he keeps a detailed diary of all the strange little absurdities of town life. For instance, he obsessively details the routine of a little old man who stands on his balcony every day just to spit on cats.
Which sounds completely random, but it highlights Tarrou's intense focus on the bizarre routines humans create. But Tarrou doesn't just observe, he steps up. He decides to organize voluntary sanitary squads to help the overwhelmed medical authorities fight the disease.
He goes to Rieux with this plan, and during their conversation, Tarrou asks Rieux a very pointed question. He asks, what did he think of Father Panelou's sermon about divine punishment?
Rieux's answer is deeply revealing. He says he's seen too much of hospitals to relish any idea of collective punishment. He says that while plague, like all evils, might help men rise above themselves, when you actually see the misery it brings, you'd need to be a madman or a coward or stone blind to give in tamely to the plague.
Rieux is fighting against creation as it is. Tarrou points out that this means Rieux's job is a never-ending defeat, because death always wins eventually.
Rieux agrees, but says that's no reason to give up the struggle. When Tarrou asks who taught him this, Rieux replies with one word: suffering. It's not a grand, complicated philosophy. It's a visceral, practical response to human pain.
This raises an important question, which the narrator of the text addresses directly. What is true heroism?
Right.
In a lot of literature, the people fighting the plague would be depicted as shining knights, motivated by grand ideals of self-sacrifice. But Camus explicitly declines to vaunt the courage of the sanitary squads in overglowing terms.
The text says that those who enrolled had no such great merit because they knew it was the only thing to do. The unthinkable thing would have been not to bring themselves to do it. It wasn't about grand romantic heroism. It was about fighting the plague as a matter of simple, logical duty.
It's the philosophy of common decency. It's like realizing your house is on fire. You don't need a philosophical reason to grab a bucket of water. You grab the bucket because the fire is there.
But for Tarrou, his personal motivation goes incredibly deep. Later in the story, he tells Rieux his backstory, and we really need to pause here because this is the core of the entire text.
It really is.
Tarrou says, I had plague already, long before I came to this town and encountered it here. He obviously doesn't mean the biological disease. Can you give us an ELI 5, explain it like I'm 5 on what Tarrou means when he says he already had the plague?
Absolutely. When Tarrou says he had the plague, he means he was complicit in a system that caused death and suffering. Tarrou explains that as a young man, he believed he was fighting for justice. He joined political movements, radical groups, fighting to make the world a better place.
But he came to realize that the society he lived in, and even the revolutionary movements he supported, were ultimately based on the death penalty. They were built on murder.
He witnessed a man being sentenced to death, and he realized with horror that he had had an indirect hand in the deaths of thousands of people by approving of acts and principles that lead to execution.
He realizes that even in the pursuit of a good cause, he was spreading a moral infection.
Exactly. Terry says that everyone has the plague within them. No one on earth is free from it. The plague, for Tarrou, is the innate human capacity for violence, our complicity in systems that harm others, the willingness to let others die for an ideology.
He says that the violence, the selfishness, is natural. All the rest, health, integrity, purity, is a product of the human will, of a vigilance that must never falter.
That is a staggering insight. It requires a tremendous willpower to avoid breathing in somebody's face and fastening the infection on him.
So how does he live with that? If we all carry this moral plague, what is his solution?
He resolves to fight the microbe of violence everywhere. He refuses to pass judgment or be a rational murderer. His goal, he says, sounds simple to the point of childishness. He wants to be an innocent murderer.
Innocent murderer is such a contradictory phrase.
It is, and he knows it. He knows he can't completely avoid causing harm just by existing in society. Merely participating in the global economy causes indirect harm. But he wants to strive as much as humanly possible not to join forces with the pestilences of the world. He wants to minimize his infection rate through constant, deliberate vigilance.
And so, organizing the sanitary squads is Theroux's way of fighting the biological plague, just as he fights the moral plague. It's an act of pure, unselfish solidarity. He works tirelessly to wash the sick and carry the dead.
And meanwhile, the absurdities of life continue. The little old man who used to spit on cats now finds his balcony overlooks empty streets because the authorities have killed all the cats to stop the fleas.
The old man is bereft because his tiny, absurd routine has been destroyed. Theroux watches it all, and he keeps working.
But despite all this effort, despite the squads and the exhaustion and the pure intentions of people like Theroux and Rieux, the plague continues its relentless march. The bacillus does not care about your moral purity. And this brings us to what is undoubtedly the most harrowing and pivotal scene in the entire text. It is the moment that breaks the philosophical stalemate of the town.
You were talking about the trial of the new anti-plague serum on the young son of M. Othon, the magistrate.
Yes. Up until this point, the deaths have been discussed mostly in statistics or abstract terms, or we saw adults like Monsieur Michel passing away relatively quickly. But Dr. Castel has finally developed an anti-plague serum locally, and they decide to test it on this young boy whose case seems hopeless.
All the main characters, Rieux, Theroux, Castel, Grand, Rambert, and significantly, Father Panelot, are gathered around the child's bed, watching to see if the serum will work.
The translation spares us no details here, and it is a devastating sequence to read. It describes the child's small face, rigid as a mask of grayish clay. The serum doesn't cure him. It seems only to strip away his body's natural shock, prolonging his agony so he feels every ounce of the pain.
He doubles up his limbs, bringing his thighs above his stomach, and then slowly his lips part. And from his mouth rises a long, incessant scream.
The text says it hardly varied with his respiration, filling the ward with a fierce, indignant protest. It was so little childish that it seemed like a collective voice issuing from all the sufferers there. It is the angry death cry of all innocent victims throughout history.
Everyone in the room is shattered by it. Rieux clenches his jaws. Theroux looks away. But the most significant reaction belongs to Father Panelot.
This is the priest who stood in the pulpit and preached that the plague was a justified punishment from God for the sins of the town.
Now he gazes down at this completely innocent child suffering unimaginably. Panelot sinks to his knees right there in the ward. He prays aloud, his voice hoarse across that never-ending wail. My God, spare this child.
But the universe is silent. The child dies anyway.
So what does this all mean? For the characters, it changes absolutely everything. The prolonged, agonizing death of an innocent child completely shatters the neat theological idea of a moral universe where suffering is simply a justified punishment for sin. What sin could this child have possibly committed to deserve that?
After they leave the hospital, the tension explodes. Rieux turns on Panelot fiercely. He practically yells that this child at least was innocent, and Panelot knows it. Rieux says he will refuse to the end of his days to love a scheme of things in which children are put to torture.
It's a profound rejection of any philosophy or theology that attempts to justify the suffering of the innocent. Panelot is deeply shaken. This event forces him to reevaluate his entire theology, which leads to his second sermon. And the contrast between his first and second sermon is one of the most brilliant structural elements of the novel.
How does this tone, Jane?
In the first sermon, he used the accusatory you. You sinned, you're being punished. In the second sermon, he uses we. He includes himself in the suffering. He tells the congregation they must learn what the plague has to teach them, but he abandons the idea of easily explained divine retribution. Instead, Panelot presents his congregation with the ultimate existential dilemma.
He pushes them to the edge of the cliff.
Exactly. He says that the suffering of children is the crucial test of faith. Because we cannot understand it, it forces us to a precipice. He argues that there is no middle ground anymore. You cannot isolate yourself or offer half-hearted prayers. You must either completely hate God and reject him, or completely accept his will, even when it involves the incomprehensible torture of the innocent.
Total surrender or total rebellion.
Yes. He says the love of God is a hard love, demanding total self-surrender. He cites the historical example of a monk during the Black Death in Marseille who stayed alone while his 77 companions died and his brothers fled. Penelou is essentially saying that true faith means staying in the fire and accepting the incomprehensible without demanding an explanation.
But for Rieux, Tarou, and the other workers on the ground, they simply don't have the luxury of time for these theological dilemmas. They are drowning in the physical reality of the plague. The psychological toll of the child's death, compounded by the relentless daily grind, pushes them into a state of profound exhaustion. The text describes a strange indifference coming over them. Rieux realizes he and his friends have stopped reading the newspapers or listening to the radio.
When they hear of a rare recovery, they show a stolid indifference, like soldiers worn out by a long war who have ceased even to hope for an armistice. They just mechanically do their jobs. It's a bleak enlightenment. Rieux thinks that if he were less tired, the all-pervading odor of death might make him sentimental. But with only 4 hours of sleep a night, he sees things in the garish light of hideous, witless justice.
This mechanical endurance of the frontline workers contrasts so sharply with the general public. While the doctors are numb, the public is desperately consuming prophetic literature. The text mentions people avidly reading Nostradamus or ancient apocalyptic prophecies, trying to find any sequence of events that implies the plague will end soon.
Which is another classic human coping mechanism.
Yeah.
They're looking for reassurance in the stars because they can't find it on Earth. They want a timeline. They want someone to tell them, according to this text in the 1500s, it ends next Tuesday. It's another attempt to impose order on the absurd.
While almost everyone is suffering through this exhaustion and terror, there is one character who is having the absolute time of his life. And we have to talk about him because he represents such a fascinating, dark, psychological response to widespread disaster. His name is Cottard.
Yes, the case of Cottard is a brilliant psychological study. Before the plague, Cottard was a traveling salesman, but he was a deeply paranoid man. He had committed a crime, we never learned exactly what it was, but he lived in constant terror of the police knocking on his door. He was so isolated and desperate that he actually attempted suicide just before the plague broke out.
But once the gates close and the plague takes over, Cottard completely blossoms. Rieux runs into him, and Cottard says he's never felt fitter in his life. He is beaming with satisfaction. He becomes highly sociable, engaged, making friends, and he even gets very wealthy by operating in the black market, smuggling goods into the quarantine city.
Tarou spends time with Cottard and analyzes exactly why this is happening. Why does the suicidal paranoid criminal thrive in a deadly epidemic? It's because of the psychology of complicity. Tarou realizes that before the plague, Cottard was a lonely man who hated loneliness. He lived in a state of constant solitary fear. But now, the entire town is living in fear. His internal terror is finally matched by the external world.
He is no longer an outcast. He is just like everybody else.
Exactly. The plague levels the playing field. As Tarou notes, everyone is a suspect now. Everyone is trapped. Everyone is looking at their neighbor with mistrust, afraid they might pass on the infection. Cottard is perfectly at ease under this reign of terror because he's been living it for years. It's his natural habitat.
He actually relishes his complicity with the townspeople's superstitions and panics. He enjoys the fact that the police are too busy dealing with the dead to look for him. The catastrophe has paradoxically given him his freedom and a sense of belonging. But the tragedy of Cottard is that his happiness is entirely dependent on the suffering of others. He needs the plague to continue to maintain his sanity and his social standing. And this sets up a terrible crisis for him when the situation finally begins to change.
Right, because eventually the plague does begin to ebb. It happens in January. After months and months of this endless, monotonous death, the statistics finally start to show a decrease. Dr. Castell's serum starts working more consistently. Rieux notices that the rats are returning to the streets. The disease seems to be losing its grip, almost as mysteriously as it arrived.
And this change sends Cottard into a violent tailspin. The source text describes his abrupt changes of mood during these weeks in January. For days, he will cold shoulder everyone, shut himself in his room, and only venture out furtively at night like he used to. Then he'll swing back to being desperately sociable, asking everyone if they really think the official announcements mean the plague is over. He asks Tarou, is it supposed that the plague wouldn't have changed anything and the life of the town would go on as before?
Guittard is terrified of returning to a normal world where he will once again be an isolated outcast and likely arrested by the police who finally have free time. When the official announcement is made that the plague is retreating, Guittard completely loses his mind. He ends up barricading himself in his apartment and shooting at people in the street until the police arrest him. It's a violent end to a man who could only find peace in chaos.
The rest of the town, of course, is cautiously beginning to hope. They are hesitant at first, having been beaten down for so long, but as the mortality figures continue to drop, the anticipation builds. Finally, the day arrives. The gates of Oran are opened.
The scene at the reopening is incredibly moving, but it's very complex. The town erupts in joy. There is an uproar of bells ringing, guns firing, bands playing, and deafening shouts. The text paints this vivid picture of the cool, clear light bathing the town, the smells of roasting meat and Anne's-flavored liquor returning to the streets, and above all, it's the scene of lovers reunited. The physical exile is over.
Rieux walks through the streets and sees these passionate pilgrims, couples locked together, hardly speaking. The text says they proclaim in the midst of the tumult with the proud egoism and injustice of happy people that the plague was over. They calmly deny that they had ever known a crazy world where men were killed off like flies. They just want to erase the nightmare and melt into each other's arms.
But Rieux observes something deeper in their faces. He realizes that despite their joy, they have the faces of emigrants. They are forever changed. They bear the marks of long banishment. They had been subjected to a precise savagery that instilled an odious freedom, and even in their reunion, they are scarred by the knowledge of what they have endured. You cannot unsee the absurd once you have lived with it for a year.
And amidst all this public rejoicing, there is a quiet, devastating personal tragedy that hits Rieux. Just as the town is saved, literally just before the gates open, Rieux catches the plague.
It is a heartbreaking, deeply unfair turn of events. Rieux, the man who fought so tirelessly, who wanted more than anything to be an innocent murderer, who kept his vigilance longer than anyone, is struck down at the very finish line. Rieux and his mother care for him in their home. The text describes Rieux listening to the whistling of the plague in the stagnant air of the sick room, realizing that the pestilence, hounded out of the streets by the cold and the crowds, had taken shelter in this room for one last offensive against Rieux's inert body.
Rieux fights it with all his strength, but he dies. Rieux says it was a peaceful struggle and then a defeat. And right after Rieux's death, Rieux receives a telegram confirming that his wife, who had been in the sanatorium all this time, has also passed away. Rieux has lost his best friend and his wife, just as the rest of the town is celebrating the return of their loved ones.
And it is in this precise moment of profound personal loss, surrounded by the public shouts of joy rolling against the terrace walls, that the narrator reveals his identity. Throughout the entire novel, the narrator has been an unnamed, supposedly objective observer. But finally, the text states, "This chronicle is drawing to an end," and this seems to be the moment for Dr. Bernard Rieux to confess that he is the narrator.
It's such a powerful reveal. Why did he write it? Why did he adopt the tone of an impartial observer for the entire story? Rieux explains that his profession put him in touch with everyone, allowing him to give a true account. But more importantly, he resolved to compile this chronicle so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace.
He wrote it to bear witness. He wanted to ensure that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done to these plague-stricken people might endure. He wanted to state, quite simply, what we learn in a time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to disguise.
Which is an incredible conclusion to come to after watching a town get decimated.
It is. Despite the cowardice of some, the opportunistic evil of Guittard, the bureaucratic denial, the hollow theology, the fundamental actions of people like Tarot, Grand, and the sanitary squads show a quiet, enduring nobility. They did their duty. They fought the abstraction.
There's a beautiful moment near the very end where Rieux is talking to his old asthma patient, the one who spent the whole plague moving dried keys between pots. The old man talks about how people are saying, "We've had the plague here, expecting medals for it." And the old man asks, "But what does that mean? Plague? Just life, no more than that."
Just life. It strips away all the grand metaphors and theological justifications. It's the ultimate acceptance of the absurd reality of existence. We suffer, we endure, we do our duty, and life goes on.
What an incredible journey. We've gone from the first dead rat on a landing, through the bureaucratic denial, the closing of the gates, the mass-produced grief of exile, the desperate search for meaning, the grueling work of the sanitary squads, the horrific death of an innocent child, the bizarre thriving of complicity, all the way to the euphoric yet deeply scarred opening of the gates of Oran.
And Rieux leaves us with a chilling final realization. As he listens to the cries of joy rising from the town, he remembers that such joy is always imperiled. He knows what the jubilant crowds do not know, that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good.
He says it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests. It bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves. And that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and the enlightening of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city.
It's a profound metaphor for the darkest parts of human nature, for violence, apathy, complicity, and fascism. The plague is always there, sleeping, waiting for us to drop our vigilance.
Which leaves you, listening to this right now, with a profound question to mull over. If the plague is a metaphor for those dark aspects of human nature, for the apathy and isolation we allow to creep into our lives, where are the rats hiding in your own daily routines today, just waiting to be noticed?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a heavy one, but an important one. We will catch you next time.